Hi, good afternoon. Those just entering, I'll just give it a minute to let the entrance tick up, as I think it takes Zoom a minute to initially let people in. Right, I think it's probably done any initial ones, so we will get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Unequal Treatment, Transforming Social Economic Diversity in Access to Medical Degrees and also to the medical profession. My name is Dr. Rebecca Montague. I'm the Acting Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust. And today's webinar is following on from last week's publication of a new Sutton Trust report by the same name. That report included some new data that was done by some academics at UCL, including one of our speakers here today, that looked in detail at access to medical schools. Today, our expert panel will share insights on inequality and access to careers in the medical industry, including in access both to the medical degrees and then going on to the profession. We'll also cover, after they've spoken, some of the Sutton Trust recommendations on what could be done on access before we open up the floor to questions from the audience. So before we get started, I will just introduce you to today's panel. So Professor Catherine Wolfe is a professor of medical education research at UCL and is a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Catherine is one of the lead authors on the Access to Medical Schools section of our Unequal Treatment report, and she'll be talking us through the research findings shortly. We also have Dr. Paul Wybrow. Paul is a medical sociologist and methodologist interested in interdisciplinary approaches to understanding medical practices, population health, and social inequities. Paul joined the Hull York Medical School in 2019 as the academic lead for the health and society theme of the MBBS, and I'm sure he will tell us all about that shortly. Yasmin Baker. Yasmin is a fifth-year medical student with a first-class honours in BSc in management, and she also is a Sutton Trust alumni. Yasmin is also the co-founder of More Than Medics, an organisation dedicated to enhancing access to diverse career opportunities across the medical industry. We also have two speakers who are both from the British Medical Association, and they'll be splitting their talk together. Ohima Asara is the Deputy Co-Chair with a focus on widening participation at the BMA Medical Students Committee. She's a fourth-year medical student at the GKT School of Medical Education at King's College London. We also have joining her Imogen Shaw, who is the Deputy Co-Chair with a focus on widening participation, also from the BMA Medical Students Committee. She's a fourth-year medical student, also at the GKT School of Medical Education, King's College London. Just also say that Imogen is currently joining us from Tanzania while she's there on a placement. We think the sound and everything should work okay, but it may be that her and Ohima have to sub in across each other, depending on how we get on with the tech issues there. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Professor Catherine Wolfe, who's going to talk us through some of the findings from her research.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody, nice to be here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this is going to work. So I hope that's okay.
Yes, it works.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So yes, I'm Kath Wolfe from UCL Medical School, and I'm going to talk through the results of our analysis that we did for the Sutton Trust. So our study was on access to medical school, and that's because getting into medical school is often called the biggest hurdle in any doctor's career. So nearly everybody who gets into medical school in the UK will end up working as a doctor in the NHS. So that means that the number of medical school places that there are is a key determinant of the size of the medical workforce who are educated in the UK. And the number of places is set by the government. And the government and the previous government have long known that the NHS needs more doctors. So in 2018, 5 new medical schools were opened in areas with not many doctors. And Aston University also admitted its first medical students. And then more recently, the NHS has promised to double the number of medical school places. And again, these are focused on areas with fewer doctors, but also there's an imperative to widen the social profile or level up training. So why is that? Well, it's because we've known historically that there's been an underrepresentation of applicants who come from disadvantaged backgrounds in medical school. So those applying to medical school, but also even among those who do apply, those from disadvantaged backgrounds have historically been less likely to get an offer. So actually getting into medical school is more like the biggest hurdles in a doctor's career, because it is very competitive, and it is, applying to medical school is more complex than applying to other degree courses. So it can pose potentially quite a lot of challenges. So over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been quite a lot done to try and widen access to medicine. There's been the introduction of gateway courses that are specifically targeted at students from widening access backgrounds, and they have an extra foundation year. I think nearly all medical schools, or all medical schools now, use contextual admissions, where they'll take into account an applicant's background and the context in which they achieved their grades when they're making offers. As I mentioned, there are new medical schools, and there are also a wide variety of different types of outreach activities that raise aspirations and provide practical support to applicants from widening access backgrounds. So our study really aimed to look and see how much impact that's had and what's changed in access to medical school from 2012. So we looked at trends in the characteristics of people applying, getting offers and entering. We looked at new and established medical schools and gateway and standard entry courses. We looked at what affects whether applicants, particularly those from deprived backgrounds, get offers and enter medicine. And we also looked at the type of schools and colleges that send a lot or not very many applicants as well. The data that we used were on nearly 94,000 applicants over that 10-year period. And this is about half of everybody who applied to study medicine in the UK. And we restricted it to people who were living in England, pretty much applying straight from school and applying for the first time. The data that we use come from the UK Medical Education Database, which is run by the General Medical Council with Medical Schools Council and a number of other bodies. And what it does is it makes anonymised data on people who applied to medical school or who are training available to researchers who've been approved in a very secure manner. So what did we find? Well, we found that the number of applicants grew quite a lot over the period, but really since the pandemic, that hasn't been matched in the number of places that there are at medical school. So who were these applicants who were applying? We looked at a number of different characteristics of these applicants, but we focused particularly on index of multiple deprivation, which is how deprived the neighbourhood that somebody lives in is. And we also looked at their socio-economic status based on their parents' job. So IMD is used a lot by higher education institutions when they're doing contextual admissions. And NSEC or socio-economic status is widely accepted as a key measure of social mobility. So what did we find? Well, we found that there was an increase in applicants and entrants who were coming from the most deprived neighbourhoods. And that was correspondingly, there was a drop in the proportion who were coming from the least deprived or wealthiest neighbourhoods. When we looked at applicants from those most deprived neighbourhoods, they were actually more likely to get an offer and enter medical school than those who lived in wealthier areas who had equivalent grades. However, when you didn't take into account their attainment, they're actually less likely to get an offer or enter medical school. So what this indicates is that attainment or predicted attainment is still a barrier to applicants from the most deprived areas. But also it demonstrates, I think, what we know, which is medical schools are using IMD to select students for contextual admissions. Now, there was an increase in the proportion of applicants and entrants from the lowest socioeconomic group, but that percentage is still quite low. And you can see that with that kind of red line at the top, that still the majority of applicants and entrants are from the highest socioeconomic group. We also saw that applicants from the lower socioeconomic groups were less likely to get an offer than those from the highest groups. However, there was no difference after we adjusted for their predicted A-levels, UCAT and GCSEs. And similarly, when we looked among offer holders, they were less likely to enter medical school. But once you adjusted for their A-level grades, then there wasn't any difference. So this indicates that attainment and predicted attainment is still a major barrier to applicants from lower socioeconomic groups. Now, in terms of schools, we saw that there was more of that growth had come from the non-selective state school sector than from independent or grammar schools. So the proportion from grammar schools stayed about the same, whereas the proportion from independent schools dropped quite significantly. However, independent schools were still more successful. So applicants from independent schools were more likely to get an offer, and they were more likely to enter, even after taking into account their attainment or their predicted attainment and their socio-demographics. And when we looked at the schools, independent schools had the most entrants for every applicant they sent. So this suggests perhaps that independent schools are preparing their students better for the admissions process, but they may also be selecting students who have more resources and support anyway, for example, doctor parents or some other things that help them get into medical school. Now, looking at how far students lived, and remember the focus on under-doctored areas, on shortage areas, we found that 40% of the applicants who we looked at, who were English, were from London or the southeast. And actually, the opening of new medical schools doesn't seem to have reduced the furthest distance that applicants were willing to travel. So when we looked at the medical schools they'd applied to, the furthest one was still really quite far away in 2022. In fact, it was slightly longer difference on average. And when we looked at how far entrants to medical school lived from the postcode that they'd applied from, it was quite far, 174 kilometres on average. Now, looking at gateway courses, we found 15% of all applicants had applied and 4% entered. And they did attract and admit students from more deprived backgrounds. And the most deprived applicants were more likely to get an offer if they applied to a gateway course compared to those from similar backgrounds with equivalent grades who didn't apply to a gateway course. And they did live closer, students who entered gateway courses, but it was still 135 kilometres away on average. Now, new medical schools, we looked from 2018 to 2021, during which period 18% of applicants applied to these new medical schools and 4% entered. And again, they attracted and admitted more students from deprived backgrounds. And actually, the most deprived students were more likely to get an offer if they applied to a new medical school compared to those who didn't apply. And entrants did live closer to their medical school if they entered a new medical school, but still, on average, they were living quite far away. So, in summary, when we looked over the period at medical school admissions, we found that there are now more applicants per place, and that those applicants are now coming more from non-selective state schools and from deprived neighbourhoods. There are also more from the lowest socioeconomic group, but that percentage is still very low. We found new medical schools and gateway courses have been admitting more deprived students. However, low attainment is still a major barrier to students from those backgrounds, even if they're applying to those courses. Independent schools are still providing advantages, even over and above attainment, despite there being relatively fewer applicants from independent schools. And some new medical schools in particular are admitting more local students, but generally applicants are still willing to travel very far to be a doctor and get into medical school.
Okay. Great, thank you so much, Kath. And there's lots more in the main report as well, so please do take a look at it if you haven't already. Just also to remind everyone as we go along that there is a question and answer function available on the Zoom. If, as you're listening to the speakers, you think, oh gosh, I really want to ask about whichever thing you've just heard about, please do pop it into the Q&A as we go along. You can do it right at the end if you want once we open up the Q&A, but we will be taking a look and having a think about which ones we will be answering when we get to that section. And now I will hand over to Dr. Paul Wybrow.
Hi there, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Dr. Paul Wybrow from Hull York Medical School. And thank you, Rebecca, for, I think, whoever sent you my little blurb, it wasn't me, so it was a bit long-winded. I think it just probably came straight from the website, but so I'll give you another introduction. I'm a non-clinical lecturer at Hull York Medical School. I've been here for 6 years, and we're a medical school with 2 universities because higher education admin's not hard enough, so we've got 2 universities to work with, and we've had a gateway program for 6 years. So I'm the director of the program as well as a lecturer. And I also lead our widening participation work. Hull York Medical School is 20 years old, so we're one of the new universities, but one of the older new universities, I guess. We expanded a few years ago, and then, as I say, we've had a gateway program for 6 years, which means, excitingly for us, is that we've got our first gateway cohort is graduating this year. So we're planning on making a big fuss of them and really celebrating that. I've only got a few minutes, so I will just maybe give you some of my thoughts of doing this job for a while and what concerns me, what I think some of the challenges are. And actually hearing Kath's presentation is fantastic, and this whole report is really, really helpful. I'm really proud of what we've achieved. I think you can tell that we've got a more diverse mix of students. I should say here that I suppose when I'm talking about widening participation, as Kath highlighted, we've got the gateway program, but then we also have our contextual offers. So we will look at certain widening participation criteria in our applicants. They will get more chance of being invited to interview, and then that will also be considered as part of that the final decision-making process. So we have that, and we also have the gateway. One of the best things I've heard as an anecdote of how we're doing is that some of our first and second year students call what they say is the gateway effect, which is this idea that our gateway students who have done a foundation year and going into year 1 are already kind of ahead of the game in terms of being ready to learn, having some of the basics around evidence-based practice and things like that. I'm very keen on telling students and colleagues or external colleagues that that's what the gateway should be doing. I don't like the language of a leg up or anything like that. These students have deserved to be here, and in a very real sense, they are paying to be here. They're taking a 6-year loan, which is a serious commitment if you do come from lower socio-economic backgrounds. So one of the things I think we're really keen on is making sure that we're showing that value to the students, and that they're kind of hitting the ground running, if you like, when they make it to year 1. I probably haven't got long left because 5 minutes goes very quickly. One of the I was asked to talk about some of the challenges. Some of the challenges I think are really important and have taken up a lot of my time is reliable data. I think much like the Athena Swan, if any of you are involved in that gender equality within higher education, I think the first challenge is always to make sure that we're measuring things accurately. So, for example, that we can see how our students are doing. I think one of the things that would make me anxious is the idea that we would be letting students in and they would be not doing well in the course. So, and that's been quite hard to manage, is getting reliable data, monitoring our students while they're here, and making sure we're giving them the best support. So thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Great, thank you so much. And next, if I could hand over to Imogen Shaw and Ahima Asara.
Hi, my name is Ahima Asari. I am Deputy Co-Chair of the Female Medical Student Committee and a fourth year medical student at GKT. Myself and Imogen will be talking about our personal experiences of being from a WP background and also our recent BMA work. And so I'll use WP as one specification as like a short form, just like for ease. Now, I knew that studying medicine for me was always like a dream of mine, but I kind of imagined the barriers on the way, from financial to having a good actual network around you. UCAT prep, interview prep, work experiences were all things that I knew about, but was quite hard to navigate myself. Now, I had quite supportive teachers and other people in my community, but that was still quite hard process to navigate at the time. Now, at the time of applying to medical school, I actually was eligible for quite a few WP or gateway schemes, but I just didn't know how to find this information myself or where to really start. And so though I've entered medical school through a standard course, I would be considered WP by a number of medical schools. And oftentimes you are told, once you enter medical school, you'll be fine. But honestly, that's where the work really does start. But some medical schools kind of stop their support there at admission, which we find quite unfair. Now, whilst at medical school, there was a point in time where I was working 3 jobs and also balancing my studies and other extracurriculars such as research, which I found absolutely impossible and very, very difficult. And so I became a BMA rep and joined other like-minded students like myself who wanted to stop that experience for everyone else to go through that, and for anyone else to go through that in particular, because it was really difficult to navigate and really, really just challenging, whilst also balancing everything else that comes with medical school. And I do believe that if we do embrace a more diverse medical population, we do create better, well-equipped doctors who are able to navigate and recognize healthcare inequalities and treat the wider public. I've definitely had some time on placement where I've been able to relate to and help a patient due to my own backgrounds, which I think is invaluable. And I do think we should promote this a lot more and making sure that we do create a better workforce of doctors. I'll be passing over to Imogen if she's available now.
Hello everyone, thanks Nima. My name is Imogen Shaw and I'm the other co-deputy chair of the Medical Students Committee at BMA. I'm a final year graduate entry student and medicine wasn't really on my radar until a bit later in life. And once I was lucky enough to be awarded the place, I was also quickly radicalised into realising just how inaccessible medicine was if you weren't from a privileged background. So some of the work that we have undertaken within the BMA over the past couple of sessions has been to improve the awareness of resources available at each university to students. And we're trying to amalgamate this into one place. We're currently finalising this sort of centralised resource with the help of external stakeholders and just to check the accuracy, check everything's up to date. And then we'll publish it on our website as soon as possible. And there are so many great resources out there for students from a widening participation background. But a lot of the issue is just knowledge of these and accessibility as well. So, but another issue that we realised was that there was no one definition for what widening participation was. We realised this is because widening participation is nuanced. For example, there are geographical considerations, but ultimately it may create more confusion if students are considered widening participation under some schemes and not others. So we've tried to create a universal definition for widening participation as a bare minimum for stakeholders to adopt, including specific inclusion criteria that we've been working with our education, inclusion and culture team, who have had a big input into that. And this will hopefully also be published very soon on the same webpage as the centralised resource. This definition will also allow us to better coordinate with charities and organisations that offer help to students from these backgrounds. We began partnering with a couple of these last year, and frankly, the more of these we can partner with, the better. More resources are always welcome to students, and the more that we can gather, then the better armed these students are. But widening participation is inherently intersectional, and to talk about it without talking about the elephant in the room, which is money, is doing it a disservice. So the BMA also launched a Fix Our Funding campaign this year to draw attention to the drop in funding that students actually receive. This number is around £4,000 on average, and has led to around 50% of students who consider leaving medicine. This is often not acceptable, and it affects widening participation students disproportionately more. So please have a look at that campaign and see what you can do to support that. There is so much to be done for widening participation, but we're hoping that these things are a step in the right direction, and we're really excited to be able to talk to you all about this today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much both. And for the final speaker on our panel, I'd like to welcome Yasmin Baker, who is an alumni of a Sutton Trust programme, and she can perhaps speak a bit more about that as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Rebecca. So as mentioned earlier, my name is Yasmin. I'm currently a 5th year medical student at Imperial College London. But if you had told me this 5 years ago that I'd be standing here sharing my story, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And that's because I come from a low income, lone parent background on free school meals from one of the most deprived areas in the UK. And like many others from my background, I don't really have family members who had entered medicine. So there was no clear pathway laid out for me, no tutors, no guidance, no insider knowledge on how to navigate the competitive application process. Unlike my wealthier peers who had structured support, connections handed to them, I had to actively seek out my own way to find opportunities and find my way in. And at my state school, many were interested in medicine, but when the offers came through, the numbers told a different story. In my year group alone of 1,000 students in year 13, only roughly about 5 of us, and that's including myself and my brother, received offers. not because they weren't capable, but because they didn't have that mentorship, resources, or tailored guidance and support from our teachers to navigate the application process that favours privilege over potential. This aligns with the report, with independent school applicants being 1.5 times more likely to receive offers than those from non-competitive state schools. And that's the reality of the medical schools admissions in the UK. Again, it's shown in the report that only 5% of medical students are from the lowest socio-economic backgrounds. For me, everything changed though when I attended the Sutton Trust Summer School at Cardiff University. And that's because that experience also transformed my mindset. For the first time, I was surrounded by students just like me, from similar backgrounds, with the same drive to succeed. We bonded instantly, but until then, I just felt very isolated. The admission tutors at the summer school didn't also just teach us about the process, they actually gave us that insider knowledge, the strategic advice that private schools provide as a standard. This experience wasn't also just about getting into medical school, it was also about that confidence building, believing in yourself that you can actually get in and that you do belong. And at this point, that's when my dream became my goal. And then today, standing here as a medical student at Imperial, I can say my goal has become a reality. But my story is not an isolated one. We need a medical workforce that truly reflects the communities we serve. Doctors don't just treat the symptoms, they treat people. And patients feel more comfortable, more understood, and better cared for when the doctors come from diverse backgrounds and actually understand their struggles. Yet, the report shows that medicine remains one of the most social, economically exclusive professions. And if we actually want a healthcare system that truly serves everyone, it can't remain accessible to only the privileged few. So recognizing these barriers, I've dedicated myself to helping others break through them too. I've worked with Imperial's Widening Participation Programme, WATCH. I've helped with the research team at the Aspiring Medics, recently on their innovation and AI powered platform that gives students real-time MMI feedback. And I've also co-founded More Than Medics, an initiative supporting especially underrepresented medical students and doctors, ensuring that they not only just get into medical school, but they actually succeed in their diverse medical careers. So overall, what needs to change? Again, I think a fair access review is needed. Medical schools must adopt a sector-wide approach to widening participation with stronger contextual offers. For example, when it came to my offers, I received 3 out of my 4 offers. Yet some of those offers were contextual, widening participation offers. Some of them weren't. Actually, my Imperial offer was not a widening participation offer, despite me getting onto the Sutton Trust programme, which clearly shows I am from a widening participation background. There's clearly discrepancies on how universities categorise widening participation. Till this day, I still don't understand why I didn't get that contextual offer compared to my other unis. Mentorship and representation is needed too. Seeing someone who's walked that path makes that difference. And I stay involved in the Sutton Trust Alumni Network because I know how firsthand this mentorship can be powerful. And long-term university support, as mentioned earlier, widening participation cannot stop just at admission. Universities must actively track and support students throughout their entire medical school journey. As a medical student who is from a widening participation background, I face a lot of financial barriers moving from Liverpool all the way to London. The cost of living crisis is really impacting me. I've had to work part-time whilst doing a full-time medical degree. I've had to work even harder with my academics just to be on the same level as my peers. Overall, medicine needs to reflect the society it serves. If we want, again, a healthcare system that truly represents and understands all communities, we must ensure that the talented students, regardless of their social economic background, have that equal chance to succeed. And I'm very grateful for all the opportunities like the Sutton Trust that have helped me get here. But opportunity shouldn't just be a matter of luck, it should be given.
Great, thank you so much to Yasmin and for all of our panel for sharing both your work and also your experiences. Please do keep the questions and answers coming in. We're getting some really interesting questions that we will come to shortly. But so we've seen the problems that exist. We know from the research that attainment specifically is a really big challenge still. What can actually be done to try to widen access and deal with those attainment issues also earlier on in the education system? So the report included a whole host of recommendations from ourselves at the Sutton Trust, both on what the government can do and also what medical schools can do to try to combat these issues. So when it comes to improving attainment in schools, there's a whole host of issues in terms of what we would suggest from government. Just to name a couple, actually making sure that we're dealing with making sure that pupils have the right teachers, It's a particular issue, teacher shortages in the sciences, and where there are teacher shortages, we know that they tend to impact the schools with the most disadvantaged intakes the most. And we have recommendations for government in terms of increasing teacher bursaries, actually widening them to include biology as well, which isn't currently part of the existing bursary scheme. And also looking more widely at the attainment gap. We've lost since the pandemic 10 years of progress in closing that gap between the poorest young people and their better off peers. That needs a whole school change across the education system from the early years all the way through, and the support that we're giving those students. And as we've seen, that's really vital to actually getting change on this issue. When it comes to medical schools themselves and what government could do there, we've recommended that in any expansion of medical school places, that they actually prioritise the schools that have a successful record on widening participation for any additional spaces, because we want to make sure that those spaces are accessible where we know that schools are already successful at doing so. And we also think more widely that access to higher education isn't making the progress that it should, and that the government should be looking right across the higher education sector at what can be done to actually move the dial on access. As we've heard from our speakers, student finance can also be a major issue. During the years that a student medic will have access to the normal maintenance loan, we know across the board in higher education that that maintenance loan hasn't gone up with inflation, that lots of students are really struggling with day-to-day living costs. And we want to also see the reintroduction of maintenance grants so that those students aren't saddled with the highest amounts of debt. But also specifically in medical school, the later years of support should also be reformed to make sure that the NHS bursary is actually providing enough maintenance day to day up front for those students to be able to meet the cost of living. And finally, we've got a host of recommendations to medical schools themselves. As we've heard from our speakers, actually who's considered WP and how that's communicated to students can differ quite substantially. And one of our recommendations is actually to make sure that that is really clear to students, that we're really making sure that what offers they are or aren't going to be eligible for is clear, and that they know how to apply for those offers. Also making sure that they are making more ambitious use of contextual offers where they take into account the context in which a young person has received their grades, and to really take into account their potential. One of the other issues as well that's come up in the report is that students who have high A-level grades, who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, actually do worse than their peers in the UCAT, specifically the medical school admissions test. And we think there really needs to be an examination by medical schools in how that test is used, perhaps, for instance, using different border levels for where they will give somebody an interview where they're from a lower socio-economic background. So just a few of the Sutton Trust recommendations there, and you can see more detail within our report. I will now head over to the Q&A, and please do keep popping the questions in. So I'm going to start with some of the media coverage for this report, and also the Medical School Council's previous report looking at some of these issues suggested that medical schools may be dumbing down by allowing in students on contextual offers. Does the panel think this is happening, and potentially could that be a danger for patients? Do you have any issues around that? If I could start with Paul.
No, absolutely not. I think that would be a big misunderstanding of what this is. You know, when we're talking about widening access, what we're talking about is fair access. And I did notice in the comments, someone else put a, thoughtful comment about, are we reducing the gap around things like soft skills? Soft skills is an odd area, but and this is very complicated, and I don't want to dominate the discussion, but actually, a wider a group of people who are coming in to study medicine are coming in with all sorts of different skills. And actually what we actually see, what I would see on the ground, is it's often the other way around. I would actually say that students who have come from maybe a bit more of a sheltered background or an independent background, haven't had alternative work experiences, haven't worked with or provide informal care, for example, that's the tough bit to level up. It is the interpersonal skills, the critical thinking skills. And actually, when you're diversifying the intake of students, you're actually seeing more of those skills coming with the students coming in. So I think partly what's in this discussion, and I will stop, is, students at A level have a very closed form of learning they're doing, very textbook form of learning, but to be a doctor you need a much more broader critical understanding, and that's a whole different lot of skills, and that's not often represented in what we're looking what's in the admissions.
Would anyone else like to come in, maybe one of the medical school students, on what's expected of you and the things potentially you have to pass before you finish medical school? Yeah, Imogen.
Yeah, so I think that it's not dumbing down at all. I think the purpose of sort of these programs is just that initial barrier that students from less privileged backgrounds face. I think these gateway courses actually just kind of reduce that barrier and allow students to kind of play on a level playing field or a more level playing field for one of the sort of first times. And so after that, they've still got to pass all the same university examinations, all the same OSCEs, they've got to pass all the same hurdles that any student from a more privileged background would have to do. So I don't think there's sort of any issue, even though I can appreciate the sentiment, I don't think there's any kind of actual dumbing down. It's actually just sort of trying to even out the playing field and make things a bit more accessible for those students. Yeah.
Great, and I want to give Kath a chance to respond to this as well, but I'm going to pose another question to you at the same time, Kath, if that's okay, which is, someone has asked if the panelists would suggest, what the panelists suggest medical schools should do about widening access and contextual offers if IMD and area-based measures may not be targeting the most disadvantaged students. So could I put both of those questions to you, both on what measures medical schools should best use, and also the question on whether or not it is dumbing down?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we know that attainment at school is not just reflective of somebody's ability or their motivation. I mean, it does reflect both of those things, but it's not just that. It's also about the support and the help that you get, which I think lots of the other panelists have talked about as well. And there is evidence that students who get better grades at more poorly performing schools then will go on to do better once they get into medical schools than those with equivalent grades who've been to schools where they've got more support. So that, you know, there is evidence around that. I think what we've talked about and what people have talked about around the kind of diversity of measures that are being used and the ways in which they are being used by different medical schools, I think I'm not sure that all of those ways are necessarily backed by evidence. And I appreciate that it's challenging for medical schools in admissions to consider the ones that they've got, the measures that they have access to and how they can best use them. But I think we do need more research on the best ways and the most evidence-based ways to ensure that that admissions are doing their job properly and not putting up barriers to people who could be great doctors. So I think that's one of the things. In terms of the measures that they should use, I think it's partly that's my answer as well, which is that, you know, if you just look at the deprivation of the area that somebody comes from, then that is meaningful, but it's not the only thing that's meaningful. And having an understanding of their own financial and economic and social background growing up, as well as the type of school that they went to, I think both of those things are important as well. But again, it has to be based on evidence. And I think the fact that we have that UK Med database really is an amazing thing that the General Medical Council and Medical Schools Council have done. And so I think there is the potential actually to create some of that evidence to support medical schools.
Great, thank you. And does anyone else want to come in on either of those questions before we move on to the next one? We're happy to carry on. So this is a question to either Catherine or Paul. do you feel the gateway courses help reduce the gap between working class students and students that enter medicine from traditional backgrounds? And do you feel it has or can reduce any attainment gaps that may exist between these two groups of students at the end of medical school? If I could put that to Paul first.
It's a complicated, I feel like everything I want to say is just it's complicated. So I suppose in one very real way, it wouldn't reduce the gap if those students hadn't come in the first place. So what would you be comparing it to? What I do think is important is that monitoring. So you're looking at if there is an attainment gap. What I look at quite closely is number of students that might have to resit an exam, or worst case scenario is if a student had to drop out or something like this. What I wouldn't want to see is that the gateway students were not performing equivalently, and what we've seen is that actually our gateway students are performing equivalently, and in some ways, in some areas, they're excelling. And anecdotally, I'll often see our gateway students are student reps, starting clubs, and I think that comes from that confidence. And it's funny, students who are early in their career or applying to medical school, they're very much focused on those, let's say, hard skills or what they learn in A levels, whether they got an A or a B. But if you speak to, I don't know what the other panelists think about this, but if you speak to other people who are clinicians or practitioners, what's between an A or a B is not very much. But what was really important is that, do you know how to lead a discussion? Do you know how to communicate ideas? And do you have that confidence? I have spoken to so many gateway students, the one in particular who came to me and said, well, the thing you have to understand, Paul, is I'm not really bright. I'm just very good at doing exams. And that imposter syndrome is so common, so common. And I would say actually common with lots of medical students generally, but definitely with a gateway. And actually challenging them to say, well, actually, the good and bad news is, good news is you are that bright. Bad news is I'm going to expect as much from you as I would any other student. And so having that time to build up the confidence is hard to overstate.
I've seen a lot of nods there. Ahima, would you like to add anything on that issue?
Yes, definitely. I think when you enter medical school as a whole, it's a really intimidating process, let alone where you feel as if you might not necessarily belong. If you enter through a gateway scheme, or you more or less maybe feel as if you quote unquote cheated the system, which isn't necessarily true at all. But it's a case of when you are entering a space which is very unfamiliar to you, no one really explains to you how it works, how to really exceed or excel. And it's something you have to kind of navigate on your own, especially since a lot of medical schools will kind of just stop giving you support at admission, and then they just won't follow up at all. And so imposter syndrome is definitely something that I myself have felt, and I'm still navigating and working it for myself, as well as other medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds, because there's always an element of doubt in your head if you really do belong in that particular environment, especially when surrounded by a lot of other students who come from much more privileged backgrounds, who understand how to gain research, how to navigate placement, even just to study appropriately. That's a whole different hurdle in itself, which sounds small, but once these things add together, they really do compound to a wider issue in the sense of belonging for WP students and how to get to medical school essentially unscathed. But yes, it's a much wider problem when it comes to just the culture of education around medical school and how to address these feelings adequately. I do think, again, for gateway courses are definitely not a form of dumbing down for students. I think it's quite a simplistic way to look at it. There are many other metrics to being a good doctor. People who mentioned soft skills, social skills, I do think having a wealth of experience before medical school and having to understand a wide background, having that empathy towards people is an amazing skill which can't be understated and really does show during placement and during clinical years. I have myself been in situations where I've seen a patient where I know that I can relate to them on a more personal level, where I do understand where they're coming from. In particular, especially nowadays, a lot of patients can't necessarily afford prescriptions. And having to draw from those experiences myself has been really helpful in actually connecting with patients. And I do see other particular students might not understand those issues, might find it quite hard to actually talk to patients in that aspect because they just don't understand how this can be so. But it's a reality for the wider public currently. And I do think that when you do look at the wider public and the demographic that we're going to be treating in hospitals, it's important that our doctors do reflect that demographic and they do reflect those experiences, as that does lead to better care overall.
Great. And Kath, I will give you a chance to answer this in just a second, but I want to pose this and another question to Yasmin first, which is, you've been asked specifically in the chat, with no or very few examples of what was possible for you in entering medicine, how did you create that vision of possibility for yourself?
I think for me, the way I created that was, I think, having that initial drive. As a person who had to be very independent, I wasn't really given much support throughout my state school. I think I do have kind of that innate drive to succeed. I know I want to, but I know there were barriers in the way. And I think that aspect of confidence is really crucial. I actually gave a speech, last year about how the Saturn Trust program really impacted me. And one person said that actually it was really refreshing to hear my experience about the Saturn Trust program, because it wasn't the aspect of the fact that there were admission tutors to tell me how the process works and what to do to, score well in the process. But it was the fact that the program gave me that confidence to believe in myself. And that's what support can do. The gateway programs can give you that confidence to realize actually you are capable of doing it. You are capable of achieving. And actually, if it wasn't for the Saturn Trust program, I probably wouldn't have had the confidence to apply for Imperial in the first place. Actually, the Saturn Trust at the time provided a program at Imperial. So I could have chosen the Imperial program, Cardiff program, and I think there was one other program at the time. And I didn't believe in myself. I didn't believe I'd get into the Imperial Saturn Trust program. I was like, I can't, that's not me. I'm from, Liverpool. I come from the low socio-economic background. I don't think I'm that smart. I don't know. I had all these kind of negative perceptions and imposter syndrome about me. But as soon as I applied to the Saturn Trust program and got in and realized that actually I do have that potential, that made me more confident to apply to Imperial. And actually having the resources and knowledge and the correct support from the Saturn Trust meant that when I went back to my state school, who didn't really know much, actually, when it came to my UCAT score, for example, I had done very well in my UCAT, and my teacher didn't really know much about the UCAT and told me actually my score was really bad. And at that moment, that could have really impacted me. I could have been like, okay, gosh, my score's bad. Maybe I shouldn't apply to Imperial, King's, etc. But because of the support I had from the Saturn Trust and other widening participation programs, I was able to recognize that actually, no, I do now know the knowledge of what a good score looks like. And I didn't listen to that teacher. And in the end, I still applied and I managed to get my offers. So I think that confidence is really important. But then that confidence and that support needs to continue post getting into medical school, as mentioned earlier. There's a lot of imposter syndrome. When I came to Imperial, I was one of the only students from the north, from a widening participation background. I felt very out of place, quite frankly. A lot of people who apply for London usually are students who are currently studying in London during their secondary school experience. So for me, I had major imposter syndrome. But schemes like, for example, academic tutor schemes, where it doesn't, making sure that you have the right financial support, the right academic support, the right welfare support throughout your medical school experience, can ensure that you still keep that confidence up and you kind of lose that imposter syndrome, and it makes you realize that you have that potential, you are worthy of the place you get at medical school, and that will ultimately impact you as a doctor. And as mentioned earlier, actually, sometimes those who come from a widening participation background actually have more of those soft skills that you need as a doctor. For me, I've gone through a lot of struggles. I've understood different people's experiences. I've had that exposure to that. I understand how I need to communicate or tailor my communication to different people with different needs. And that has ultimately, I think, impacted me when it came to my clinical exams, where I was able to perform very well in those because of those soft skills I've developed through my experience. So I don't think we're dumbing down. And I think these kind of schemes are really important, especially to build the confidence. It's not just about the knowledge, it's about building that confidence and making those students realize that they have the potential to succeed.
Thank you. And Kath, did you have anything you wanted to add on either of those points?
Yeah, I think that, as people have said, I think actually, when people get into medical school, there's a whole host of issues that they have to face. So some of those are going to be psychological, with this idea of, imposter syndrome. And actually, even before my university did contextual admissions for medicine, we had an outreach program that supported students. And, this was it's a summer school, and there's a mentoring program that goes on for a year that students can get. And I remember a student coming to me who was in final year of her medical degree, who had had that support from Target Medicine at application, and she said, "Oh, I feel like it's really unfair because I've had this extra support that other students haven't." And it really made me realize that actually it's quite invisible I think, the huge amount of additional support that students from more privileged and advantaged backgrounds get. I think that when that is the norm, it becomes invisible. And so then, you know, a student's thinking, well, I had a week's summer school when I was 16, and I've been able to see a mentor a few times and come to a few aptitude test preparation sessions. You know, she thought that that was equivalent to the support that somebody would get from attending private school, from having parents who are doctors or other professionals. And so I think we need a kind of wider recognition as well of the kind of huge levels of support that students from more traditional backgrounds are getting and having as well. And I hope that maybe that would reduce some of that imposter syndrome. The other thing I think, though, is when students get into medical school, we know that on average, students on 3 of the largest and longest established gateway courses, which actually doesn't include the one at Hull York, their graduates don't have as good outcomes. So the dropout rates are slightly higher, and the postgraduate postgraduate exam pass rates are lower as well. And I think that does indicate that medical schools need to be able to support students throughout. And we've had lots of examples about the sorts of support that maybe students need. And I think that medical schools and universities generally are extremely in very, very difficult times right now. And there's a lot of financial pressure on the sector. I think that, you know, student needs, and maybe this is partly a result of the pandemic or partly some other issues, you know, students are coming to university and generally needing more support as well. And obviously the financial situation is more difficult for everybody. And I think universities, and that includes medical schools, are really stretched in the support that they can provide as well. So I think that it would be, you know, I don't just want to say medical schools should provide a lot extra, you know, without them also receiving more input and support to be able to provide that extra that students need.
Great, thank you. And Paul, I'm going to come to you in just a second, so if you want to add anything there, but I've also got another question to pose to you from the chat, which is, how can we better equip staff who are personal tutors to students from WP backgrounds within the university as academic lead for widening participation? Is there any kind of training or manual that they could create for them? What would you recommend in terms of providing that support?
This is difficult. So what training would we provide for somebody who was supporting a WP student? And I think this relates a little bit to that, my views, which I think are difficult, and maybe not everybody's views, about how we do support for WP students once they're at university. I think absolutely, I mean, I've been saying that for a long time, that actually we need to stop looking just at admissions and look at how the students are doing throughout. One of the complexities of this is, for example, when I started doing this role, a colleague of mine came to me and said, well, we need to do special after-school classes for our Black students. We're going to provide extra support. And I can see that sort of thing's well meant, but actually when you start looking at the details, that's very complicated. A lot of our Black students come from very wealthy, privileged backgrounds, maybe from overseas students. And actually a lot of our students, particularly in this area, actually sort of coastal towns, white boys are some of the most underrepresented, more from lower socio-economic backgrounds. So when we're talking about bespoke support for WP students, we have to be very careful. Who gets to go on that program? Is it just the gateway students? Is it anyone who comes in a contextual offer? And then there comes the question of making sure that we've got a good, fair, supportive system for everybody. And Kath just mentioned well-being, and I would definitely second that. We're seeing a lot of support needs from our students for disabilities, mental health, dealing with the pressures of cost of living crisis, which is affecting us all. And our student wellbeing team, I'm gesturing over there because their office is over there, they do a lot of amazing work and they're under a lot of pressure, but we need to make sure that that is catered for everybody. So to come back to your question of how do you train somebody to support somebody for a WP student, I mean, in the way, it's good patient care, right? You listen, you have to be there for the student, you've got to appreciate what's available to them, what resources they have, and what their needs are. In a way, we should be providing that for all of our students. So it's a complicated question, and I think we need to be careful that we don't other this group called WP, which actually is a very heterogeneous group that come from all different backgrounds and have different needs. So I think training and support for all our students is required. I'd be really careful about how we think about as bespoke training to support WP students.
Great, thank you so much. That's all the time we've got now for the question and answer section. And I just want to end with saying such a huge thank you to our panel for sharing your expertise and experiences. And I want to give a final bit for the audience, just to say, for any of you who work yourselves in medical schools, please do have a look at the report. Please do have a look if there are things that you could take back to your own teams in that school to think about things that you could do to make your processes clearer to widening participation students. If there are any things that you could do in terms of wider support for them, very much taking into account, though, Kath's point on the need for potentially more financial support to medical schools to allow them to be able to fully offer that support. We ourselves as an organisation will be continuing to raise these issues with government and other policymakers. So we'll be using this report to really drive the case for an increased focus on this, to make sure that we're thinking about it all the way through the school system and how not having that work to close the attainment gap causes issues all across different professions, and the access of those from working class backgrounds to those roles. As well as some of the specific asks around medical schools. And if you are a young person or a medical student who's kind of going through this process at the moment, please do let us know any thoughts that you've got. We've got a contact us form on our website of any barriers that we've not spoken about, things from your experience that you're keen for us to be aware of and know about when we're continuing to do this work. And yeah, thank you so much again to the speakers and to everyone for coming along today.